Tom got started pretty early in caving.
Yes.
That's a picture from Wyandotte Caverns when it says he was 11 months old.
Yeah. At the 1954 Louisville NSS convention.
53.
52?
Yeah.
All right. 1952 NSS convention. We had become good friends with the Gurneys, Russ Gurney and Gene Gurney, when we were in New York City, and done a lot of caving with them. So at that time, Russ Gurney was interested in making a papoose rig. So he said, well, as long as I'm making one, I can make one for you guys. And so he did. So when we arrived at the convention, he gave us a duplicate papoose rig, and so Tom Brucker rode around in that, and one of the Gurney daughters was in the other one, and I recall that made that picture. That was kind of exciting at the time.
I just thought it was kind of a neat little picture of Tom getting started in his caving career.
Yeah, well, he was probably one of the few babies nursed in Great Onyx Cave.
The caption this says, Joe and Mrs. Roger Brucker with 11-week-old Tommy.
Yeah.
And Jean, Mrs. Russell Gurney with 8-month-old Susan paused on the pre-convention tour of Wyandotte Cave.
Yeah.
The papoose boards were made by Jean Gurney and provided ideal transportation for the youngest spelunkers. Roger and Russ took a turn too.
I suppose I could unplug that phone. Maybe that's what I ought to do.
Well, we can just pause when it rings.
Okay.
This convention highlights Jim Dyer's fancy footwork in the elimination dance contest after the banquet had him in first place until the Jitterbug platter came up. Then he gracefully yielded the floor to younger blades Joan and Roger Brucker, tying for top honors with Charles Fort and his fiancée. So you were like a Jitterbug King, I guess.
Well, we danced our way through Oberlin. I remember the Lindy was the Jitterbug dance, and if you studied it, well, you could learn a lot of variations to it. And I remember during my time at Oberlin, I practiced all of them with various partners, and eventually with Joan. And so we got pretty good at it. And people would clear off the dance floor to watch when we did that.
How you were offered the job of editor of the time it was called the American Caver, and then that changed into being the Bulletin. It seemed to be some confusion about the direction of which newsletters were doing what in the early days of the NSS. The first 3 years, they have like assorted letters, not really an issue. Then you had the NSS News, and at the same time you had the Bulletin, which at the time was serving as the organization's newsletter. And then at some point they switched roles where news became more of the popular trip report type stuff, and the Bulletin started becoming more scientific. And somewhere in that transition, you became the editor of the American Caver, and then the Bulletin, following a guy named Ludlow.
I followed Ludlow, and I think I edited maybe 3 bulletins. They were all called the Bulletins. They were not called American Caver until after I turned over the job to somebody else.
Okay. So after your successful trip with Bill Austin to Crystal Cave in '53, I guess it was.
Yes.
People went on to organize the C3 expedition, which is Cullen's Crystal Cave.
Yes.
So tell me about how the expedition came about, and what you were trying to accomplish in the expedition.
The NSS had run one very extensive expedition into an eastern cave. The name escapes me at the moment, but during the interim between that expedition and 1954, a number of cave explorers such as Joe Lawrence Jr. And Aki Lloyd and other early cave explorers had come to Crystal Cave from VPI. I think they were going to Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Bill Austin took them on the rinky-dink, and then maybe 1 or 2 more trips. So they had more experience in Crystal Cave, and they, while they had explored larger caves in Virginia and Pennsylvania, they all recognized that Crystal Cave was very extensive and complex, confusing. So I think Howard Sloan and Bill Davies and a few other people of the NSS, and Ivan Sanderson, who was the PR president of NSS, decided that that the NSS ought to run a big expedition to a cave, and they checked around, and at that time Dr. Pohl and Bill Austin were in negotiation with the National Park Service, and the National Park Service wanted to buy the inholding that was Crystal Cave inside the National Park and another inholding called Great Onyx Cave. And presumably they didn't want to pay very much for it, something like $1,000 an acre or less. Pohl and thought that they ought to get a lot more money for that and he and Bill Austin figured out that if they could get a major expedition there and get a lot of publicity for it, it would raise the perceived value of Crystal Cave. So they approached the NSS about the time that the NSS was looking for a publicity opportunity, and thus George Moore was involved in all of that also. So the plan was then to have an expedition in February of 1954 with cavers from here, there, and everywhere invited, and Jim Dyer was sort of who had been the manager of Crystal Cave before Bill Austin, was sort of appointed as second in command since he knew the cave. By that time, Jim Dyer knew me, knew Phil Smith and Roger McClure, so he asked us to stick with him and help with the expedition. So we said, okay. Well, he picked me to work on the publicity since I had written the book about since I had been writing cave stories for newsletters for a while, and he asked me to be his apprentice, really, and so as the time for the C3 expedition came closer, he was in touch with Coles Finnessy from Sports Illustrated, who was a writer for them, and Robert Halmy. Robert Halmy was a photographer at that time in New York. So they signed so there was an agreement between True Magazine that would publish the story of this expedition and pay some money for it. Ivan Sanderson negotiated a deal with Funk and Wagnall's publisher to publish a book and got an advance of some thousands of dollars. I once heard it was $10,000 to write a book about the expedition. And at any rate, I stuck with Jim Dyer, and that's how I met Skeets Miller and the various publicity people, Coles Finnessy and others, because I took them into the cave and gave them a lot of information that I had picked up and sometimes carried their baggage. I forgot whether your question.
I just asked you about how the expedition got started.
Yes, well, it got started because it seemed to be a publicity opportunity for the NSS. At the same time, they were invited by Dr. Pohl to run an expedition at Crystal Cave. And since Joe Lawrence had taken his VIP caving buddies there, he was a logical person to appoint as expedition leader. And so Joe Lawrence proceeded to put together a large team of people, including a telephone wire party that would string telephone wires into the cave. He picked up Tom Barr, who would be the biologist, and he picked up several other people here to be lieutenants in his organization. I don't think I was part of his organization. I was attached to Jim Dyer. And Phil Smith and Roger McClure were peripherally attached to Jim Dyer also. He brought those people along. So at any rate, the whole question of what the objectives were, I think Joe Lawrence thought that all they had to do was to run a telephone line into the cave and send parties out from there to survey. The problem was that there really wasn't a lot of expertise in anything in the NSS back in 1954. There were a few people who surveyed in Pennsylvania and Virginia, and we had surveyed in southern Ohio, small caves, but nobody had any experience with a large cave system. So he didn't have any idea about how to organize this expedition. I'm speaking now with hindsight, because I remember the frustration at the end of that expedition. That was a terrible way to run a railroad, let alone a cave exploration. And we could do it better. In fact, Joe Lawrence and Phil Smith and I collaborated on a paper pointing out the lessons we had learned from the C3 expedition in the area of communications and mapping and various aspects of that. That was published early on and presented at an NSS convention at Natural Bridge. But it took a while before we actually recognized that surveying the cave was the only way to understand it, and that surveying was not just something else you do, that exploration was really fruitless, because all you got out of exploration was a good story, and that faded away after time. So the whole Cave Research Foundation was organized around surveying. And we found it fairly easy to recruit people, because we discovered that most cavers did not like to survey. They'd like to go on a trip, do 2 or 3 caves on a Saturday, and maybe one Sunday morning sit around the campfire and drink beer on Saturday night. So we recruited people who were apparently athletic and pretty well put together, and oftentimes engineers who we introduced to big caving and surveying, so that that's all they knew. You know, if you're going to do a cave, well, you survey it. So we trained up a bunch of cadre of people who didn't know anything about this social part of caving. And that's more or less the way it started.
If you look at the history of the CRF that they've got published out there on their page, it says it's the direct descendant of the expedition to Crystal Cave. And what did you decide, now that you're looking back in hindsight with 70 years of caving experience, how do you organize something like a long-term project like the Mammoth Cave, Flint Ridge Cave system? And I noticed that Bill Steele gives you some credit for being the model they use for their Mexican stuff.
Yeah. Well, a few years after the C3 expedition, we realized that it was one thing to sit around and criticize the C3 expedition, but we began to realize that you got to start somewhere, and that was a bad start. So we had been negotiating to try to get into other caves in Mammoth Cave National Park, and were not successful. And Joe Kaliza, at one point a retired superintendent, said to Phil Smith, well, if you want to get into the cave, you have to detach yourself from the Thomas family, because everybody thinks you're their agents, and form a scientific organization that is for real. Well, Phil Smith by that time was doing science management for the government in the Arctic and Antarctic programs. So he had a background in how to do this. And we had an understanding of organizations that volunteer organizations fall apart after a while. and they fall apart for several reasons. One is they are started up by charismatic leaders. The charismatic leaders grow old, and after a while they criticize the younger people, and they get so mad they take the maps and burn them or go away, and that's the collapse of volunteer organizations. So we decided we would put together an organization that would last for generations, and that led us to the idea of project caving. Project caving is a term you hear now and then around the country, but at the time we started the Cave Research Foundation, there weren't project caving organizations. And that is an organization that is designed to self-perpetuate, self-support, not using publicity, but gathering talent of people and recruiting scientists. So we set it up with a very, very simple constitution. One of the things the Park Service was concerned about was liability. What if we got stuck in the cave like Floyd Collins and ended up with a sensational death or rescue? Wouldn't the Park Service get a bad name? And the Park Service apparently knew that you cannot waive liability. You couldn't get a release from people that would hold it up in court. And we met a lawyer in Pittsburgh who was a caver who said, oh, this is very simple. You just go back to English common law, and there is a relationship called a joint venture. So you have joint venturers. You don't have people who are employees, they're joint venturers. And that is, if the venture goes wrong, why all of the people share equally in the risk, and nobody is responsible. That is, there's no corporation to sue. No leaders can sue because they're all joint venturers. Well, that turned out to be a genius piece of the whole thing. So we convinced the Park Service that by having all of our people in CRF joint venturers, that would solve the problem of the release of liability. Well, we did several people put together the constitution of the Cave Research Foundation, and it has served very, very well for, about 70 years, and enabled us to recognize that we were picking up expertise in negotiating with government cave managers. Well, there were organizations in Carlsbad, that was the first one, and they were running into a bureaucracy that they couldn't handle. And they came to Cave Research Foundation and said, how do you do this? And we told them some things. And after a while, they came and said, is there any way we can join CRF? So we said, well, yeah, but you would be co-equal. We're not going to just cause the demise of other organizations. You can maintain your own structure here locally, and we'll help you with the negotiations. Well, that set a pattern, and we began to pick up other places. The Kings Canyon in California was the next project we picked up. We picked up Buffalo River, National River, that's still operating. Cumberland Gap Cave, that's another project of the Cave Research Foundation. We ran one expedition to Guatemala And but one of the early things we did was we heard that some people in West Virginia were starting an organization called Weaveacts. And in about 1958 or 9, we learned that they were doing that, and we said, well, let's invite them, let's meet them halfway and invite them to a big dinner at a hotel and talk to them about Project Caving, because we had a couple of years of experience and they had none. So we did that, and that was a terrific meeting because it got another set of people oriented on how to do this, how to negotiate with government officials, and how to set up training programs so that you've always got new people coming up through the ranks, because the longevity of a caver is about 5 years. And then they find girls, or they find parachuting, or they find something else to do. So you've got to bring in people a little faster than the attrition. So these were central ideas that seem very simple now, but we began to build them into the structure of how we worked. Another thing we did was to, right off the bat, we started off with a scholarship program for graduate students. I think the first grant was $2,500, and that's now up to about $10,000 a year. But that was the input of a bunch of brand new scientists who became teachers who had graduate students themselves. So suddenly we got this inpouring of scientific talent, new scientific talent, coming out of graduate schools all over the country. That was a simple idea that I'm sure Phil Smith came up with that idea, and it worked out from a sort of a pilot project to a full-blown program. So there have been literally hundreds of graduate students who've gotten a grant or a fellowship from CRF, and they send their own students to compete every year for, there are usually 3 or 4 fellowships and a couple of grants out of this program. So it isn't much, but it's more than other organizations are providing for cave studies.